In the late 8th century, as the rest of the world lay in the deep slumber of the Dark Ages, a storm was brewing in the frozen waters of the north. This storm was not merely a wind from the sea. It was the footsteps of the Vikings, the most brutal and disciplined warrior society history had ever seen. This story is the saga of Ragra, a man who carried the destiny of an entire people on his shoulders. Born in the deep fjords of Norway, in lands where even the sun was afraid to warm the rocks, Ragra learned early that life was a constant battle. In the Viking world, childhood was not about games. From the moment he could walk, Ragra stepped into a world of stormy seas and sharp axes. The lands of Scandinavia were infertile, the seed sown rarely sprouted, and the cold took more lives with each passing day. Throughout his childhood, Ragra saw his neighbors starve during the long winters. This desperation was the core reason that turned the Vikings into the most fearsome riders the world had ever known. They would either die at sea or survive with the riches of other lands. Ragra's education was not just about wielding weapons. He learned to read nature itself. He grasped how to navigate by the stars, how to smell a coming storm in the wind, and how to spot hidden reefs by the structure of the waves. The famous ships the Vikings called Drakkar would become Ragra's true home. The construction of these ships was a masterpiece of engineering. The strongest oak trees were chosen, and the planks were connected not with rigid bolts, but with leather ties and special jointing techniques that provided flexibility. This flexibility ensured that when the massive waves of the ocean hit the ship, the hull would not break, but rather flex with the wave. Ragra believed that the dragon head at the prow was not just to scare the enemy, but to ward off sea monsters. These ships were so shallow that Vikings could slide deep into rivers, appearing in the hearts of towns when their enemies least expected it. This mobility gave Ragra a tactical advantage his rivals could never imagine. By the age of 18, Ragra set out on his first major expedition toward the eastern shores of England. As the bells of Lindisfarne monastery rang, Ragra and his companions had already landed. To the Christian world of that time, the Vikings were seen as a punishment from God. Because the Vikings showed no respect for churches or monasteries. To Ragra, iron placed with gold was a target. The weight of the gold mattered, not its sanctity. The unarmed monks in the monasteries stood no chance against Ragra's axe. But this first raid was just the beginning. Ragra personally saw the tradition of the berserker on the battlefield. These warriors wore skins of bears or wolves and entered a trance-like state before battle. They felt no pain, beat their shields, and threw themselves at the enemy like monsters. Within this brutality, Ragra was trying to find his own identity. His sword, the Ulfberht, was forged with crucible steel technology and was lighter, more flexible, and sharper than any other sword of the time. It could split a shield in two with one blow and glide through armor like water. Viking expansion was not boiled solely on riding. It was one of the greatest networks of exploration and trade in history. After his youth, Ragra turned his route east, into the depths of Russia. The name Rus was actually a name given to these blonde rowers. Through the Dnieper and Volga rivers, they reached Constantinople, or as the Vikings called it, Miklagard, the great city. Here, Ragra saw the magnificence of Byzantium. They traded for amber and slaves, for silk, spices, and more silver. Vikings were not just warriors, they were the world's first global traders. But behind trade, there was always raw power. If a city refused to pay tribute, Viking access would come into play. Ragra also grasped the importance of the Viking legal system. Vikings were not lawless. They had a highly democratic assembly structure. Criminals were treated, compensations were set, and important decisions were voted on. However, this justice was only among Vikings. For the outside world, only the justice of the sword prevailed. Mythology was in a very breath, Ragrato. Term, the world was within the branches of the great world tree, Yggdrasil. Before entering a battle, Ragra would remember parts of the Havamal, the sayings of Odin. Odin was the god of not only war, but also knowledge and runes. After every victory, Ragra would offer a sacrifice, wanting to secure his place in Valhalla. The belief that Valkyries would choose brave warriors who died on the battlefield and carry them to the sky made Ragra's men fearless in the face of death. For them, dying was not an end, but a beginning to feast at Odin's table. This belief system was the greatest psychological weapon of Viking military success. If a man did not fear death, there was no army that could stop him. Using this fearlessness, Ragra reached the walls of Paris. The French began to flee their cities when they saw this massive fleet coming over the rivers. When Ragra besieged Paris, he wanted not just gold, but land and political power. This was the moment when Vikings began to be state builders, not just raiders. However, these endless blood feuds began to open deep wounds in Ragra's soul. Towards the end of the Viking Age, Christianity began to spread north like a creeping vine. Many Viking leaders abandoned their old gods, Odin and Thor, and were baptized to trade better with Europe. Ragra saw this change not as a betrayal, but as an evolution. Raiding was no longer as easy as it used to be. European kingdoms had improved their castle systems and established heavy cavalry units. The old surprise raids were now met with large armies. By the 11th century, the Viking Age would physically end with the Battle of Stamford Bridge. But Ragra's story was nothing at a more internal point. In the area they established in England called the Danelaw, Ragra began to live as a neighbor to the Anglo-Saxons who were once his enemies. He was now growing wheat in the fields he once burnt. He sat at the same table with the children of the slaves he once kidnapped. He realized how dim the wealth brought about by war remained beside the peace of a family. Ragra's fighting style also changed over time. While in his youth he was a savage and uncontrolled force that only attacked, in his old age he understood the power of defense and waiting. His shield was no longer just for meeting blows, but like a wall to soothe the enemy's anger. But the real war was in his mind. He had taken thousands of lives. Every notch on the handle of his axe represented a life extinguished. In his sleep at night, he began to hear the cries of the children in the villages he set on fire. Odin's proud Valhalla now looked to him like a bloody slaughterhouse. One evening, sitting by the shore, he looked at the remains of his old ship. The planks had rotted, the dragon head had fallen, the Viking age was rotting in Ragnar's body and soul. There was no longer any desire for glory, fame, or love. There was only an infinite weariness. When the final hour came, Ragnar found himself on the battlefield once again. Paging him was an army that resembled his younger self, ambitious, daring, and bloodthirsty. His own men drew their swords and clashed their shields. That familiar and terrifying rhythm of war began again. But Ragnar did not move. He slowly dismounted his horse. He took off his famous leather armor, hardened with blood. Everyone was in shock. The commander on the opposite side thought Ragnar was playing a trick and pointed his sword at him. Ragnar walked across the snow with bare feet. He left his axe, that massive silver-embossed weapon that had taken thousands of lives, on the ground as if it were a worthless piece of wood. At that moment, a strange silence fell over the battlefield. Not a sound of a sword nor a shout, only the endless wind of the north was blowing. Ragnar looked at the young soldier in the front rank of the enemy army. The boy's hands were shaking, but his eyes were burning with the fire of revenge. Ragnar saw his own past in those eyes, all that unnecessary violence, all those wasted years. He was transforming the Viking philosophy of not fearing death into a philosophy of letting life. He spread his arms. He had no shield. He had no sword. There was only himself. The commander of the other side shouted, "Why? Why aren't you fighting, you old wolf?" Ragnar took a deep breath. The cold air filling his lungs did not hurt this time. It liberated him. The words falling from his lips were deep enough to silence all the clashing of swords on that huge battlefield forever. Ragnar whispered that famous sentence that changed the course of history and broke the chain of revenge. This was not a surrender. It was the greatest victory of the human spirit against brutality. Ragnar spoke up with a slight smile, closing his eyes. "I have no enemies," because at that moment he realizes that the real enemy was not the army in front of him, but the endless hatred and ambition within man. From that day on, Ragnar's sword never left its scabbard again. The Viking age spiritually ended with his word. No gold remained, nor lands. Only this whisper of peace echoing in the wind and unarmed footprints left on the snow remained. Ragnar was no legend, not with blood, but a legend written with silence. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. But if you didn't like it, feel free to hit that dislike button. Just make sure to leave a comment and tell me why so I can improve. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.